We are counting down the top 10 most valuable and historically important comics from DC Comics with a cover date from the year 1956. Before we jump into the top 10, let's quickly look at all the new titles that DC debuted in 1956. DC had a pretty good track record of not starting too many new series each year and usually getting some winners. Some really long-running titles on this list, especially Tales of the Unexpected, which would run for 104 issues. All right, diving into the top 10. These are some mega classic books, very rare, high price tags on all of them. Starting with Showcase number 5 is the number 10 book of the year. It also ranks 98th most valuable DC comic of the entire decade of the 1950s. This was the last issue of Showcase to have the banner-style logo going across the cover. This is the first and only appearance of the Gangbusters-style Manhunters team, but not the same team that would become more famous, called the Manhunters later for DC. Cover art by Ruben Morera. Very scarce on the census. CGC has only graded 40 copies ever in all conditions combined. Only one copy in the world grades 9.0 or higher. Heritage Auctions has sold 24 copies in the last 24 years. Using the Overstreet Annual Price Guide, we can see the growth in all conditions. This book is a steady mover, nice and slow every year, but always growth. Popular title, in demand always. On the census, there is a 9.4 followed by an 8.5. Those are the highest graded copies in the market. The number 9 book of the year is Showcase number 3. Showcase was really the big hot title of the year for DC. This issue features the first and only appearance of the Frogmen. However, the characters are very similar to the Sea Devils, which would appear a few years later in the same title. This ranks 83rd of the decade, number 9 of the year. 60 copies graded by CGC, still only one super high grade copy. Heritage sold 22 copies. Interesting cover background with the colors. Again, steady movement in all grades in the Overstreet Annual Price Guide. You can see this is now a $3,300 book for a 9.2 raw copy. Consistent growth. And the highest graded copy is a 9.0. Number 8 of the year is Showcase number 2. Obviously the second issue of this series. And this one features Kings of the Wild. We've got lots of animals which were very popular in comic book sales in the 1950s. Irv Novick is the cover artist on this series. Ranked 76th of the decade, number 8 of the year. Only 42 copies graded by CGC. There are no high-grade copies of this book ever graded. Heritage has sold 24 copies of this 10-cent comic, approved by the Comics Code Authority. Again, in the Overstreet Price Guide, we can see nice, steady, small growth in all conditions every year. And it's now a $3,800 book in 9.2 raw. On the census, the highest graded copy, there are two 8.5s of this exact issue. The number 7 book of the year is Tales of the Unexpected. This was one of their new titles launching this year, which would run for a long time. Running 12 years, in fact. Space Ranger would become the main feature attraction of this title, starting with issue number 40. This one features Bill Ely cover art. And notice back then, they didn't even put the number 1 on the cover because, unlike today, having a number 1 issue meant it was untested and retailers didn't like seeing a number 1 on a cover. They wanted safe, guaranteed titles for sales. Print run estimated of this book to be approximately 192,000 copies at that time. It's the number 71 DC comic of the decade. It's also one of the most valuable DC horror and sci-fi comics ever made. There are 41 copies graded of this book, only one super high grade copy. Heritage has sold 21 of these, basically one a year. In the Overstreet Price Guide, same thing, slow but steady growth every year in all grades. This is now a $4,000 book. On the census, there is one 9.2, and if you look at issue number 2, it has no high-grade copies at all. The number 6 DC comic of 1956 is House of Secrets number 1. Now, at this time, there were a lot fewer horror-type titles on the market once the Comics Code Authority had started the year before. But DC started up this one. It's got Ruben Morera cover, again. A lot of other big-name artists on this title. This would run for 22 years and 154 issues. Swamp Thing would debut in this title, but not until issue 92 in 1971. Print run estimated about 194,000 copies of this issue. Number 6 of the year and 56th of the decade. 62 copies graded by CGC, 1 super high grade copy, and 19 sold by Heritage. The Overstreet price guide shows that this book has actually stalled in the last few years in lower grades. It's getting to be a bit pricey, but sneaking up in high grades raw, now a $4,100 book in 9.2 raw. And on the census, we have a 9.2 and an 8.5 at the top of the census. The number 5 book of the year, we finally get a superhero issue. This is a legendary classic issue. It's Batman 100. He reaches 100th issue. That was a rare occurrence back then because titles actually ran for years and years. Finally, Batman gets to 100. And it also reprints some cover classics here, including the Joker on the cover. So lots of demand for this. Print run estimated at 502,000 copies. This is the most valuable issue of Batman during the entire 1950s. It's the number 5 book of the year and 40th most valuable DC of the decade. Lots of copies of this one graded, 288 copies. There are 7 graded 9.0 or higher, and Heritage has sold 80 copies. Note that this is still a 10-cent cover issue. And in the Overstreet price guide, a bit of a jump this year after stalling a little bit for the last few years. But of course, always demand for Batman books, more than any other title for DC collectors. This is now a $5,700 book. And on the census, we have a 9.4 and 2 9.2s. The number 4 most valuable DC comic of the year, Sugar and Spike #1. This title would run for 15 years, created by Sheldon Mayer, who wrote and did the art on all of these. This is one of the scarcest DC comic #1 ever made. Very small print runs. It's the 26th most valuable DC comic of the decade, 4th of the year. Print run estimated at 209,000 copies. This title was aimed at very young readers, so of course no high-grade copies have survived in this book. On the census, there are 31 copies in total graded. Heritage has only sold 7 of these ever. This is a tough one to locate. Always moving up in the guide. People realize the importance of this title. It's an $8,900 book for a 9.2 raw grade. And on the census, the highest graded copy in the world is an 8.0 of this rare children's title. The number 3 book of the year, definitely an iconic book. You could say that without this issue, maybe we would never have had the Silver Age, and maybe Marvel would never have created all those classic superheroes with Stan Lee in the 1960s if it wasn't for this book, Showcase #1. This is the title that would land up launching all of DC's new Silver Age heroes and start a new trend in comic book collecting. So this is sort of a tryout series where every issue they would try a different title just to see if it worked out with the audiences. Print run estimated at 213,000 copies. It's the number 3 book of the year, 25th most valuable DC comic of the decade. Lots more copies graded on this book due to its significance. 98 copies graded. There is 1 super high grade copy. Heritage has sold 40 of these issues featuring firefighters. Using the Overstreet annual price guide, we can see again nice steady growth every year in all grades combined. This is a $9,600 book now. And on the census, there is only a 9.0 of this book. The number 2 comic of the year, this is a classic cover now. Detective Comics 233 features the origin and first appearance of Kathy Kane as Batwoman. We've got a Sheldon Moldoff cover and art, Stan K art as well in this issue. Now this issue is actually very significant because it predates The Flash debuting in Showcase. So you could debate that this could be the first Silver Age superhero. Some people also believe it's Martian Manhunter, who debuted just 8 issues earlier in Detective Comics 225. This is the number 2 comic of the year and 22nd most valuable of the decade. Print run estimated at 325,000 copies. Lots of demand for this title, lots of copies graded. 232 on the census. There are 2 9.0s or higher. Heritage has sold 43 of these. And we've got the whole gang here on the cover. Overstreet Price Guide has huge growth on this book in the last years. Demand is really growing for this. You can see that in the last 15 years. the book has gone up almost 4 times, and in high grade raw, it's gone up over 5 times in price. This book is really leaping year by year at this point. And on the census, the highest are 2 copies graded at 9.0, which brings us to the number 1 most valuable DC comic of the year, and this one is way ahead of the pack. Showcase number 4. Most people consider this the first comic book of the Silver Age, as it debuts the Silver Age Flash in this orange 10-cent cover. Classic cover now. And of course, the Flash hadn't been published for years by DC. They decided to bring him back as a new character, a new story, and the popularity of the Flash would create more and more superheroes for DC, eventually leading to Marvel creating all their superheroes. So not only is this the number 1 most valuable DC comic of the year, it's the most valuable DC comic of the 1950s. It's the most valuable DC comic of the last 75 years. This is the book to own if you're truly investing big dollars in comics. On the census, we have 376 copies graded. There are 8 9.0s or higher. Heritage has sold 115. Strong demand for this book, but the price tag is getting expensive on this book. Again, nice, fast growth year by year in all conditions. Hard to believe in just the last 20 years alone, the growth that this book has seen. It's gone up 7 times in lowest grades, which is quite impressive. And even in high grades, the book has gone up 4 times, but it's really into the high price tags here where you're starting to see jumps of $10,000 a year. This is a $175,000 raw price tag for a 9.2 in the price guide. Of course, if you want to see what the real market is doing with this key book, go check out ebay.com and look at their ended auctions and see what people are really getting for copies in all grades. And also check out gpanalysis.com and you can see all the graded copies that have ever sold of this book. On the census, there's an unbelievable 9.6 graded and 2 9.4s. There you go, the top 10 of the year. What we're going to do now is quickly compare these 10 books on the CGC census, which ones are getting graded the most, which ones seem to be a little overlooked. So, of course, Showcase 4 is in the lead, followed by Batman 100 and Detective Comics 233. Those are the prime superhero comics on this list, and of course, they're the ones most people want, and they're the ones that the dealers are getting graded. On the low end, the book with the least copies is Sugar and Spike number 1. Not everybody's collecting this title, but it is extremely rare and proves so by having so few copies graded. We just saw that Showcase number 4 has a 9.6, a 9.4, and a 9.2. Beyond that, you'll see that most of the titles were lucky to even break a 9.0. There you go, the top 10 of the year. We do this every week. Please subscribe to this channel. Thanks for watching.